Emily had always loved the idea of solitude. After weeks of stressful work, she decided to take a weekend off and rented a small cabin deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. The cabin was quaint, nestled between towering pines, with a small lake shimmering nearby. It was everything she had hoped for: peaceful, quiet, and completely isolated. The first day was perfect. Emily spent her time reading on the porch, taking walks through the forest, and enjoying the serenity of nature. The air was crisp, the birds chirped, and the wind rustled through the trees in a comforting way. It was the escape she had been yearning for. But as night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The once welcoming forest seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing darker and the silence becoming more oppressive. Emily brushed it off, convincing herself that it was just the natural eeriness of being so far from civilization. But as she settled into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That night, Emily was woken by a strange sound, a soft tapping at the window. She froze, her heart racing as she strained to listen. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Gathering her courage, Emily slowly got out of bed and approached the window. Outside, the forest was pitch black. She couldn't see anything beyond the glass, but the tapping continued, louder now. Emily's breath hitched as she realized that whatever was making the noise was right outside her window. With trembling hands, she flicked on the porch light, hoping to scare off whatever animal might be lurking. But when the light flooded the porch, there was nothing there. The tapping stopped immediately, leaving only the deafening silence of the night. Emily quickly shut the curtains and retreated to her bed, trying to convince herself that it was just a tree branch or a harmless animal. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She barely slept that night, her mind racing with fear and paranoia. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made her jump. The sense of being watched never left her. The next day, Emily decided to explore the surrounding area, hoping the daylight would help dispel her unease. She wandered through the woods, trying to enjoy the beauty around her, but the feeling of being watched persisted. She kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced that someone, or something, was following her. During her walk, she stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin, hidden deep within the forest. It was dilapidated, the wood rotting and the windows broken. Curious, Emily approached the cabin, drawn by a strange sense of familiarity. As she explored the ruins, she found old photographs scattered on the floor, black and white images of a family who had once lived there. The photos were faded, but the faces of the people were eerily clear, except for one. In each photo, there was a man whose face was scratched out, as if someone had deliberately erased his identity. A shiver ran down Emily's spine. The cabin felt wrong, as if it held a dark secret. She quickly left, but as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that the faceless man was watching her, just like the presence she had felt in her own cabin. That night, the tapping returned, more insistent this time. Emily tried to ignore it, but it grew louder and more aggressive, as if whatever was outside was demanding her attention. She covered her ears, curled up in bed, and prayed for it to stop. But then she heard something that made her blood run cold. A whisper, faint but clear, coming from just outside her window. It was a voice, low and menacing, calling her name. Emily. Panic surged through her. She knew she had to leave, but the voice continued, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps on the porch. The doorknob rattled as if someone was trying to get in. Emily grabbed her phone and called the nearest ranger station, her voice shaking as she begged for help. The ranger promised to send someone out, but it would take at least an hour to reach her. Emily knew she couldn't wait that long. She grabbed her keys and bolted for the door, but as she reached it, the knob turned and the door slowly creaked open. Standing in the doorway was the faceless man from the photographs, his figure tall and imposing. Emily screamed, but no sound came out. She was frozen in place, unable to move as the man stepped closer. With sheer force of will, Emily broke free from her paralysis and ran past the faceless man, out into the dark woods. She didn't stop to look back, not until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the door open. Once inside, she locked the doors and sped down the narrow dirt road, her heart pounding in her chest. The road was rough, and the trees loomed like dark sentinels on either side. But Emily didn't care. She just needed to get away. As she drove, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the faceless man standing in the middle of the road, watching her leave. His presence seemed to linger, even as she put miles between them. Emily didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town. She checked into a motel and spent the night huddled under the blankets, still trembling with fear. The next day, she returned to the city, never speaking of what happened in that cabin, but the experience haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the faceless man was still out there, waiting for someone else to find his cabin in the middle of nowhere. Tom was driving cross-country, enjoying the freedom of the open road. He had just passed through a small, forgotten town, and was now on a long stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the barren landscape. There were no other cars in sight, just the endless road ahead. As he drove, Tom noticed a figure up ahead, walking along the side of the road. It was a woman, her thumb out, clearly hoping for a ride. Tom hesitated for a moment. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something he usually did, but the road was lonely, and the woman looked harmless enough. He pulled over and rolled down the window. The woman approached the car, her face hidden in the shadows. "Need a ride?" Tom asked. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft and almost musical. She opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. Tom glanced at her, noticing her pale skin and dark hair. There was something odd about her, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As they continued down the road, the woman was silent, staring out the window. Tom tried to make small talk, but she only responded with brief, vague answers. Her presence was unsettling, and the longer she was in the car, the more Tom regretted picking her up. The road stretched on, and the night grew darker. The woman hadn't said much since she got in, and the silence was becoming oppressive. Tom felt a growing unease, like there was something wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. The radio crackled with static, and Tom reached over to adjust the dial. As he did, he glanced at the woman again. This time he noticed something chilling. Her reflection in the side mirror was distorted, almost inhuman. Her eyes seemed too large, her smile too wide. Tom's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly looked away, convincing himself it was just a trick of the light. But the unease continued to gnaw at him. Finally, he decided to break the silence. "So, where are you headed?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman turned to him, her eyes boring into his. "Nowhere," she said, her voice cold and empty. Tom swallowed hard, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. The temperature in the car seemed to drop, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to focus on the road, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The woman's presence seemed to fill the car, pressing in on him from all sides. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her staring at him, her eyes unblinking. Panic began to set in, and Tom's mind raced with thoughts of how to get her out of the car. But before he could act, the woman spoke again. "I'm tired," the woman said suddenly, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Can we stop for a bit?" Tom nodded, relieved for any excuse to get off the road. He pulled over to the side of the highway, near a small clearing surrounded by trees. The woman opened the door and stepped out, stretching as if she had been cramped in the car for too long. Tom watched her warily, not sure what to expect. She walked a few steps away from the car, then turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the still night air. Tom forced a smile, eager to be rid of her. "No problem. Take care." But as he turned to get back in the car, he realized something horrifying. The woman was gone. She had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the eerie silence of the night. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had never been there at all. Shaken, Tom got back in the car and sped away, his mind racing with confusion and fear. The road seemed darker than before, the trees closing in on him as if they were alive. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves made him jump. He drove for hours, not daring to stop, until he reached a well-lit gas station. He pulled in, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the keys. He needed a break, a moment to clear his head and convince himself that what he had seen wasn't real. But as he stepped out of the car, he noticed something chilling. On the passenger seat, where the woman had been sitting, was a single pale handprint, smeared with dirt. It was unmistakable proof that she had been there, yet there was no way she could have left it behind. Tom stared at the handprint, his blood running cold. He quickly wiped it away, trying to erase the memory of the woman who had vanished into thin air, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with him, haunting him. The road ahead felt longer and more treacherous than ever. and Tom knew that he would never be able to forget the lonely hitchhiker who had left him with a lingering sense of dread. Mark was driving through the desert, heading to a business meeting in a distant city. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. His gas tank was running low, and he hadn't seen a gas station for miles. The road ahead was empty, just a stretch of asphalt cutting through the desolate wasteland. Finally, in the distance, Mark spotted a small gas station. It was old and run down, but it was the only one for miles. Relieved, he pulled in and parked next to one of the ancient pumps. The gas station was eerily quiet, with no signs of life. The windows were dusty, and the paint on the building was peeling. Mark glanced around but saw no one, not even an attendant. He got out of the car and approached the door of the station. It creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air inside was stale, and the shelves were lined with old, expired products. Mark called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" But his voice echoed in the empty space. There was no response. Just as Mark was about to leave, a figure emerged from the back room. It was an old man, his face gaunt and wrinkled, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare right through Mark. "Need some gas?" the man asked, his voice raspy and dry. Mark nodded, trying to hide his unease. "Yeah, fill it up, please." The old man nodded and shuffled out to the pump. As he worked, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The gas station felt like it was stuck in time, a relic of the past that had no place in the modern world. When the tank was full, Mark handed the man some cash and hurried back to his car. But before he could leave, the old man leaned in close and whispered, "Be careful out there. The road isn't safe after dark." Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know what the man meant, but he wasn't about to stick around to find out. He thanked the old man and sped off, eager to put as much distance between himself and the creepy gas station as possible. As Mark drove, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the desert was swallowed by darkness. The road was empty with no other cars in sight. The only light came from his headlights, which barely penetrated the thickening gloom. Suddenly, Mark noticed a pair of headlights in his rearview mirror. At first he was relieved. Another car meant he wasn't alone out here. But as the car behind him got closer, Mark realized something was wrong. The headlights were blindingly bright, far too intense for a normal car. They bore down on him, getting closer and closer until they were right on his bumper. Mark tried to speed up, but the car behind him matched his pace, staying dangerously close. He swerved, trying to shake it off, but the car followed his every move, as if it were toying with him. Panic set in, and Mark's heart raced as he tried to think of a way out. The desert stretched on endlessly, with no turnoffs or escape routes. The car behind him was relentless, its headlights glaring like the eyes of a predator. Finally, in a desperate move, Mark slammed on the brakes, hoping the car behind him would overshoot and pass him. But to his horror, the headlights vanished the moment he hit the brakes. There was no screeching of tires, no crash, just the sudden eerie silence of the desert night. Mark's car came to a stop and he looked around, but there was no sign of the car that had been chasing him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had felt the car's presence, seen the blinding headlights, but now there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out into the darkness. Mark's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. He knew he couldn't stay here, but the thought of continuing down that lonely road filled him with dread. Summoning his courage, Mark started the car and slowly began to drive again. But the memory of those headlights haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been chasing him was still out there, lurking in the shadows. As he drove, he noticed something chilling. The gas gauge was empty, even though he had just filled up at the station. The old man's warning echoed in his mind. The road isn't safe after dark. Mark's heart pounded as the car sputtered and came to a stop. He was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal, no gas, and no way to escape whatever was out there. He sat in the car, surrounded by the oppressive darkness, knowing that he wasn't alone. The desert was silent, but Mark could feel the presence of something watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew that he would never make it out of the desert alive. The road had claimed him just as it had claimed so many others before him. And as the night wore on, Mark accepted his fate, knowing that the desert held many secrets that were best left undisturbed. Sarah was driving through the countryside, heading home after visiting a friend in a nearby town. It was late and she was tired, So when she saw a small, isolated motel by the side of the road, she decided to stop for the night. The motel was old and a little run down, but it had a vacancy sign glowing in the window. Sarah parked her car and walked into the office, where a bored-looking receptionist sat behind the counter. "Do you have a room available?" Sarah asked. The receptionist barely looked up from his newspaper. "Yeah, room 3 is open. It's around the back." Sarah paid for the room and took the key, heading outside to find it. The motel was eerily quiet, with only a few cars parked in front of the rooms. The night was dark, with no moon or stars visible in the sky. She found room 3 and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The room was basic, with a bed, a dresser, and a small TV. It wasn't anything fancy, but it would do for the night. Sarah set her bag down and went to the bathroom to freshen up. As she washed her face, she noticed something strange. There was a crack in the bathroom mirror, running from the top to the bottom. She shrugged it off, thinking it was just a sign of the motel's age, and went back to the bedroom. But as she lay down on the bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, Sarah was woken by a strange noise. It was a faint scratching sound, like something was scraping against the wall. She sat up, trying to listen, but the noise stopped as soon as she moved. She lay back down, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But then the noise started again, louder this time. It was coming from the wall right behind the bed. Sarah's heart began to race as she sat up again, this time turning on the bedside lamp. The light illuminated the room, but there was nothing there. No source of the noise. She got up and pressed her ear to the wall, trying to figure out what was making the sound. But as soon as she did, the noise stopped again, leaving her in unsettling silence. Sarah was too unnerved to go back to sleep, so she sat up in bed listening intently. For a while, there was nothing but quiet, and she started to think she had imagined the whole thing. But just as she was beginning to relax, the noise started again, this time coming from the closet. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the closet door. The scratching sound was unmistakable, and it was getting louder, as if something was trying to get out. She reached for her phone, but there was no signal. Her heart pounded as she slowly got out of bed and approached the closet. She hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the doorknob and yanked the door open. To her horror, the closet was empty, but the scratching sound continued, now coming from behind the wall. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. She had no idea what was causing the noise, but she knew she had to get out of there. She grabbed her bag and headed for the door, but just as she was about to leave, the noise stopped. She froze, listening. The silence was thick and oppressive, and Sarah could feel her fear growing with every passing second. Suddenly, the bathroom door creaked open on its own, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its features obscured by the darkness. The figure stepped forward, and Sarah let out a scream. She bolted for the door, yanking it open and running out into the night. Sarah ran to her car, fumbling with the keys as she tried to unlock the door. She could feel the presence behind her getting closer with every second. Finally, she got the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind her. She started the engine and sped out of the motel parking lot, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she drove away, she noticed something chilling. There was a figure in the rearview mirror sitting in the back seat. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized she wasn't alone. The presence had followed her, and now it was in the car with her. She swerved, trying to shake the figure, but it stayed right where it was. Its eyes locked on her in the mirror. Panicking, Sarah drove faster, but no matter how far she went, the presence remained in the car. It was as if it was bound to her, refusing to let her go. As the night wore on, Sarah knew she couldn't outrun it. The presence was with her, and it wasn't going away. She kept driving, knowing that she couldn't stop, that she couldn't escape. The road ahead was dark and endless, and Sarah knew she was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking up. Emily and her friends had planned a weekend getaway to a cabin in the forest. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and enjoy some time in nature. The cabin was located deep in the woods, far from any towns or cities. The only way to get there was by a narrow, winding road that cut through the dense forest. As they drove up to the cabin, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The trees were tall and dark, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the forest was eerily silent. but her friends were excited, so Emily tried to shake off her unease. They parked the car and unloaded their bags, heading into the cabin. The cabin was rustic and cozy, with a fireplace in the living room and a large window that looked out over the forest. There was no cell service, but that was part of the appeal, a chance to disconnect and enjoy the peace and quiet. After settling in, the group decided to go for a hike before dinner. They set out into the woods, following a trail that wound through the trees. As they hiked, Emily noticed something strange. The trees along the trail were marked with strange symbols carved deep into the bark. The symbols were unfamiliar, but they had an unsettling, almost sinister quality to them. Emily pointed them out to her friends, but they just shrugged it off, joking that it was probably just some kids messing around. But as they continued hiking, the symbols became more frequent, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest grew darker as the sun began to set, and the air turned chilly. The group decided to head back to the cabin, but as they retraced their steps, Emily noticed that the symbols were different, more intricate and disturbing than before. By the time they reached the cabin, Emily's unease had grown into full-blown fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, as they sat around the fireplace, Emily tried to relax, but her mind kept drifting back to the symbols. She couldn't help but wonder who had carved them and what they meant. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the cabin grew tense. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked as if they were alive. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. Everyone jumped, and Emily's heart raced as she stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But when they cautiously opened it, there was nothing there, just the dark, empty forest. The group laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as just the wind, but Emily knew better. She could feel the presence of something lurking in the shadows, watching them. They tried to go to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Then, in the middle of the night, she heard it, a faint whispering, like voices carried on the wind. She sat up, straining to hear, but the whispering stopped. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she got out of bed and crept to the window. She peered out into the darkness, but she could see nothing, just the trees, standing tall and silent, like sentinels guarding some ancient secret. The next day, the group decided to explore more of the forest, hoping to find the source of the symbols. They set out again, but this time the forest felt different, darker, more oppressive. As they hiked, the symbols became more elaborate, more sinister. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the air grew thick with tension. Then, suddenly, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large, ancient tree, its trunk covered in the same symbols they had seen on the trail. But these symbols were different. They glowed faintly, as if imbued with some dark power. As they approached the tree, Emily felt a wave of dread wash over her. She wanted to turn back, to leave the forest and never come back. But something compelled her to keep going, to get closer to the tree. Just as they reached it, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The tree groaned, its branches creaking as if in pain. Then, with a deafening roar, the tree split open, revealing a dark, gaping hole in the earth. From the hole emerged a figure, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. The air grew cold, and Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward. It raised a hand, and the symbols on the tree began to glow brighter, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Emily's friends screamed and ran, but Emily was frozen in place, unable to move as the figure approached her. It reached out, its hand inches from her face, when suddenly everything went black. When Emily woke up, she was lying on the floor of the cabin, her friends standing over her, their faces pale with fear. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The memory of the figure and the glowing tree was seared into her mind, and she knew that she would never forget it. The group left the cabin that day, vowing never to return to the forest. But Emily knew that no matter where she went, the forest would always be with her, a dark presence lurking in the shadows of her mind. David had always been fascinated by abandoned places. There was something about the history and the mystery of old, forgotten buildings that intrigued him. So when he heard about an old, abandoned church in the middle of nowhere, he couldn't resist the urge to explore it. The church was located deep in the countryside, far from any town or village. The road leading to it was overgrown and barely passable, but David didn't mind. He loved the thrill of exploring places that few people had seen. He parked his car at the edge of the road and set off on foot, following a narrow path through the woods. The trees were tall and dense, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. As he walked, the air grew cooler, and a sense of unease settled over him. But David pushed it aside, eager to reach the church. After what felt like hours, he finally reached the clearing where the church stood. It was an old stone building, its walls covered in ivy and moss. The windows were broken and the roof was sagging, but it still had an imposing, almost eerie presence. David approached the church, his heart pounding with excitement. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air inside the church was cold and damp, and the smell of decay hung in the air. The pews were covered in dust, and the altar was draped in cobwebs. David shone his flashlight around, taking in the details. The walls were adorned with faded paintings of saints, their faces cracked and peeling. As he explored, he noticed something strange. The floor was littered with old yellowed pages from a Bible, torn out and scattered around the church. David picked up one of the pages and read the words, but they made no sense. The letters were jumbled, forming nonsensical words and phrases. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that something was very wrong. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind him and David whirled around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was no one there, just the empty church, silent and foreboding. David's heart raced as he tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. David backed away from the door, his mind racing. He had no idea how to get out, and the church seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with every passing second. Then he heard it, a faint whispering like the sound of a dozen voices murmuring in the shadows. He shone his flashlight around, but he couldn't see anything. The whispering grew louder, filling the church with an eerie, otherworldly sound. David backed up against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel a presence in the church, something malevolent and dangerous. Suddenly the whispering stopped, and the church fell into a deep, unnatural silence. David held his breath, waiting for something to happen. But the silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, without warning, the candles on the altar burst into flame, casting flickering shadows on the walls. David's breath caught in his throat as he saw the shadow of a figure standing at the altar. A tall, dark figure with glowing red eyes. The figure turned to face him, and David felt a wave of terror wash over him. He knew that he was in the presence of something evil, something that had been waiting for him. The figure began to move toward him, its footsteps echoing in the empty church. David tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure reached out, its hand inches from David's face, when suddenly, the door flew open, and a blinding light filled the church. David gasped as he was pulled back into the light, his body suddenly free from the paralyzing fear. When he opened his eyes, he was outside the church, lying on the ground, the sun shining down on him. He looked around, but the church was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. David staggered to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that what he had experienced was real, that the church had been a gateway to something dark and terrifying. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. Jenna was an urban explorer, always on the lookout for new places to explore. She loved the thrill of discovering abandoned buildings and uncovering the stories hidden within their walls. So when she heard about an old, forgotten hospital on the outskirts of town, she knew she had to check it out. The hospital had been closed for decades, left to decay and rot in the elements. It was a massive building, with broken windows and overgrown vines covering the walls. Jenna parked her car at the edge of the property and made her way toward the hospital. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant cawing of crows. She pushed open the rusty gate and stepped inside, her heart pounding with excitement. The hospital loomed before her, dark and foreboding, but Jenna wasn't afraid. She had explored countless abandoned buildings before, and she knew how to handle herself. She made her way inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior of the hospital was even more decayed than the outside. Peeling paint, crumbling walls, and debris littered the floors. But Jenna was undeterred. She loved the challenge of navigating these forgotten places, of piecing together the history of what had once been. As she explored, Jenna noticed that the hospital had a strange, unsettling atmosphere. The air was thick with a sense of unease, and the silence was almost suffocating. She wandered through the empty halls, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The rooms were filled with old, rusted medical equipment, and the floors were covered in dust and debris. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. A feeling that she wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching her. She shook off the feeling, telling herself that it was just her imagination. But as she continued exploring, the feeling grew stronger, until it was almost overwhelming. Finally, she reached a door at the end of a long hallway. It was slightly ajar, and Jenna felt a strange compulsion to open it. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and dark, with a single bed in the center. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in what looked like blood. Jenna's heart raced as she realized that this room was different from the others. It was as if someone had been living here, performing some kind of dark ritual. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind her, and Jenna whirled around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was no one there, just the empty room, silent and foreboding. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she felt a cold breeze brush against her skin. She turned back to the bed and saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure lying under the sheets. She slowly approached the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was completely still, as if it were asleep, but as she got closer, she realized that it wasn't asleep. It was dead. The figure was a corpse, its skin pale and rotting, its eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. Jenna screamed and stumbled back, her flashlight falling from her hand. The room was plunged into darkness, and Jenna scrambled to pick up her flashlight. When she finally managed to grab it and turn it back on, the corpse was gone, vanished without a trace. Jenna's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She knew that she had to get out of there, that something was very wrong with this hospital. She ran to the door and yanked it open, sprinting down the hallway as fast as she could. But as she ran, she could hear something behind her. Footsteps, getting closer and closer. Jenna didn't look back. She ran faster, her heart pounding in her chest, until she finally burst out of the hospital and into the daylight. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she drove away, Jenna knew that she would never return to that hospital. Whatever had happened there, whatever she had seen, she knew that it was something she would never forget. Samantha loved antiques. There was something about the history and the stories behind old objects that fascinated her. So when she came across an old, ornate mirror at a flea market, she couldn't resist buying it. The mirror was beautiful, with a gilded frame and intricate carvings. It was slightly tarnished, but Samantha didn't mind. She loved the idea of restoring it to its former glory. She brought the mirror home and hung it in her bedroom, admiring the way it caught the light. But as soon as she hung it up, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small things, objects moving on their own, strange noises in the night. Samantha tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just her imagination. But the strange occurrences became more frequent, more disturbing. She would wake up in the middle of the night to find the mirror glowing faintly, as if there was a light behind it. And sometimes, when she looked into the mirror, she would see something that wasn't there. Dark shadows, flickering at the edges of her vision. Samantha grew increasingly uneasy, but she didn't want to get rid of the mirror. It was too beautiful, too unique. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences became more sinister. She would hear whispers in the night, coming from the direction of the mirror, and sometimes, when she looked into it, she would see a face staring back at her, a face that wasn't her own. Samantha's unease turned to fear as she realized that the mirror was cursed, that it was somehow connected to something dark and malevolent. She tried to take the mirror down, to get rid of it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it was stuck to the wall, as if it had become a part of the house. Samantha's fear grew as she realized that she was trapped, that the mirror wouldn't let her go. One night, Samantha woke up to find the mirror glowing brightly, the light almost blinding. She tried to look away, but she couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the mirror, unable to look away, and then she saw it, a figure standing behind her in the reflection. Samantha's blood ran cold as she realized that the figure wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was real, and it was getting closer. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its hand touching the back of her neck, and Samantha felt a cold, clammy sensation that made her skin crawl. The figure leaned in close, its breath hot against her ear, and whispered something that made Samantha's heart stop. "You're mine now," Samantha screamed as the figure pulled her into the mirror, her body disappearing into the glass as if it were water. And then, the mirror went dark, the light extinguished. The next morning, Samantha's friends came looking for her, concerned that she hadn't answered her phone. They found her bedroom empty, the mirror hanging on the wall, its surface dark and still. But when they looked closer, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A faint outline of a face, staring back at them from the glass. Samantha was never seen again, and the mirror was never moved. It remained in the house, a silent witness to the horrors that had taken place. And those who saw the face in the mirror knew that Samantha was still there, trapped in the glass, forever a prisoner of the cursed mirror.